Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Dr. Anthony Charles. Tony is a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation, especially for local communities. He's also the director of the Community Conservation Research Network and lead author of a new United Nations report on how climate mitigation and adaptation interacts with poverty and food security. Tony will discuss the UN report addressing the climate change and poverty nexus, where he shares how poverty and climate change are interwoven. He also explores the pathways of linking climate mitigation and adaptation with poverty reduction and food security. Hey, Tony, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. Nice to be here.
All right, this is a very important subject, and I think you're going to be a busy man the years ahead around this subject, as I guess the impacts of climate change are only going to get bigger. Could you, I guess, just start us off with how do you, what is the link between climate mitigation and adaptation with poverty reduction?
Well, the basics of dealing with climate change, of course, are, as you say, is the mitigation angle, the trying to reduce the extent of climate change, and then the adaptation angle of dealing with it and coming to terms with how to move forward with climate change. And both of those aspects affect different people in different ways. That's the fundamental truth, I guess, that and the more disadvantaged you are, whether you're in poverty or whether you're lacking in food or other disadvantages, the impacts of climate are going to be greater, and in fact the potential negative impacts of mitigation and adaptation can also be greater. So our study, our effort to look at the linkages is really based around the idea that climate mitigation and adaptation needs to take poverty and food security into account, and vice versa. Development, there's obviously a big issue around how does the world develop? How do poorer areas develop over time? That also needs to take into account climate issues and basically trying to make it so that climate impacts are not worsened through the development process.
You don't hear a lot about, well, maybe you do, but not so much, I guess, with the media coverage of the mitigation's role in poverty and keeping people in poverty. And if you even look at the Paris Climate Agreement, I think we all agree this is a good thing, but the richer nations, we got our wealth based on a fossil fuel economy. And so now there's this expectation maybe poor countries are not going to have access, or going to make it even harder for them to get access to fossil fuels. Is something like the Paris Climate Agreement actually maybe going to, increase poverty in the short term?
Well, that is the key question, I think, Doug. How do you implement the Paris Agreement without making the world worse for humans, for people, especially in poverty and lacking in food? How do you do that in the right way? And that's what our report is trying to explore is what are the strategies for moving forward on the climate front with the Paris Agreement, while also doing something to improve and to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, that other big international move of looking at how do we develop sustainably. And so yes, I think you're very correct in saying that the climate mitigation efforts sometimes are not really looking at the poverty and food angle when they're being discussed. But I think that the realization is there, and so we weren't discovering something brand new in the sense that there's a need to link together the responses to climate and the responses to poverty and food insecurity. We were really trying to come up with a framework for moving forward. Not that we discovered the linkages at all, but we were trying to come up with some strategies to actually deal with those linkages.
All right, so a big part of too, even the Paris Climate Agreement, there's sections on adaptation. How is the world going to adapt to climate change? And that's, that's progress in itself that it was focusing on that. Does that focus on poverty? Because it's not necessarily one and the same. When you're going to adapt to climate change, you would hope that you're factoring in poverty and reduction and such, but it's not necessarily built in there. So is the current international agreement, I guess, thoughtful to that process?
Well, yes, I think that it's coming along. There's no doubt that if you look back in time, the climate change initiatives, the UN framework on climate change, the IPCC organization, originally the focus was very much a kind of very, very centrally on climate. And indeed, that's a very valid aspect. But I think now we're realizing that you need to have these two operating in tandem. You're going to run into some big problems, for example, with climate refugees. Increasingly, as the world's changing, those who are most poor and marginalized are at risk of becoming climate refugees, people that just can't stay where they are due to climate change. It's well established that the poor and the disadvantaged are more likely to be in areas sensitive to climate impacts. That's really very clear in so many parts of the world. And here, our report's dealing with poverty. It's also talking about food insecurity, but the disadvantaged and marginalized populations are not only measured by those in poverty. Many indigenous communities all around the world, here in Canada, for example, are at great risk of climate change impacts. And, some of them are also in poverty. Some of them are lacking in food, but the disadvantage goes quite broadly. Women and girls all around the world are at a particular risk of climate change impacts. And so when we look at how to link these things together, we really need to take a kind of holistic approach to it.
All right, so you'd mentioned the report. This is a report you did for the UN. It's addressing the climate change and poverty nexus. And so even the word there, nexus. How old's the report? Is this just relatively new? And could you, give us, sort of the 30,000-foot view of what you were trying to accomplish with that report?
Right. Well, as I say, it's intended to provide a kind of a blueprint or a guidelines on how to move forward. And basically, the essential goal was to try to come up with a vision of what the world should look like when you're linking together the responses to climate and the responses to poverty and food insecurity. We essentially focused in on 5 strategic elements. One of them is to look at how poverty and food security could be more incorporated into climate mitigation and adaptation. A second one is looking entirely in the opposite direction at how climate impacts and responses can be better incorporated into development measures. An example there, just for the sake of giving an example, is what's called climate smart agriculture. Agriculture, farming activity that might be it could be any kind of agriculture, but agriculture that's thinking about the climate impacts of what's happening there. So agriculture activity that's looking at how intensive the activity is, how much fuel is being used, so the actual greenhouse gas impact, but also some of the environmental impacts that go with agriculture. So how to keep those in a sustainable way so that the climate impacts are less from that agricultural practice. So that would be one particular example where that comes in. So we're looking at both directions there. Climate being inputted into the development process, poverty and food issues being inputted into the climate responses. And that's the main theme. I mean, there's a few other angles. One that we particularly emphasize, and this is something that you mentioned in your introduction, is the local angle. how can local communities actually do this on the ground? And so we delve into that in some detail of, in fact, with one of our chapters is actually a kind of guidelines for local communities.
Okay, so let's just dig into that. You know, this is a focus area of yours, is looking at local communities. How do you take something like this report and it makes its way down? There's recommendations. There's sort of this is how you kind of look at this issue. How does a local community actually kind of act on the information that you're providing?
That's a really good question, because this is a United Nations report that we produced. It's going to countries all around the world. But there are also many organizations that took part in producing this report that deal directly or indirectly with local communities. But I think the bottom line is that a UN report goes to countries around the world. Those countries then have the capability of taking that report and implementing it on the ground in their countries. So that would be the primary way I would see this kind of filtering down to communities. But also some of us work directly with communities, and this framework can actually be tried out in that sense. In the Caribbean at the moment, there's an initiative to actually test this framework, implementing it in some of the islands of the Caribbean. So it can actually work right down to the local level, but it's going to start at a higher level. That's the nature of this report. But as I say, there are pieces in it that are very much oriented not only to what communities can do, but what countries and governments can do to support those communities, to support the local communities in trying to connect up this idea of developing in a sustainable way while reducing climate impacts and adapting to climate change. And that's a huge aspect all around the world. I've worked with Canadian communities, I've worked with Caribbean communities, and many others are doing something similar. And the communities themselves know what the issues are. They can see. One of my students worked with communities on the coast of Ecuador in South America, and she could see very clearly in everything they were telling her that they were noticing the climate change, they were needing to do something about it, and in their case, one of the solutions that they were proposing is to restore the mangroves, mangrove trees that grow along the coast of Ecuador, so that it would be a buffer to reduce the impact of storms from the ocean, coming from the ocean to the land. So brilliant, local communities have a lot of solutions.
You'd mentioned a little bit earlier is the focus on women. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate if that's even in the reports. Like, this has been going on for decades. You empower, you educate women. One of the key strategies to reduce poverty. So now you bring climate change into it, and you hear like, well, same thing. Educate women. You're going to make this area more resilient to climate change. And there's a lot of leaps there. I know I'm simplifying things there, but could you just maybe talk more about that? That focusing on women as a way to, I guess, make the communities more resilient.
Right. Well, as you say, women are often the best route to looking at development issues, food issues within a local community, and I don't want to just emphasize local communities, because this scales up to whole regions of countries, and indeed countries in cases where women and where they have the empowerment, the capability to act on development issues, poverty issues, for example. There's amazing cases of economic activities originating with women's organizations in particular. So how does that connect with climate? Well, I think that there's a certain sense perhaps that talking about climate mitigation and adaptation needs to catch up with some other discussions in involving women in local communities, involving women in thinking about what are the adaptation approaches that fit within their local scene. So there's a big scope, I think, for that kind of engagement to be broadened in that sense. And so, that the evidence is that there are so many examples of women being able to connect up climate and poverty reduction, climate adaptation, let's say, and food provision, improving food security. So I think that's it's already happening, but it's also an untapped capability in many cases.
Okay, could you tell us a bit about the Community Conservation Research Network?
Sure. Well, we've been operating for about a decade now, and the basic idea, it's not only about climate change. It's focused on local communities engaging in environmental conservation activities, and many of those are climate related, with an angle that the communities are generally ensuring their sustainable livelihoods at the same time. So in other words, we like the three words together: communities, conservation, and livelihoods. The three go together. At the community level, conservation is often supporting local economies. And so I think in a climate context, what we see this coming up where some of the conservation activities are actually mitigating climate change. Like I mentioned, mangrove forests on the coast in the tropics, for example, or it could be tree planting anywhere in the world. It could be greening the environment around a community through replanting of native species, for example. All of these things have a climate mitigation benefit, but what we're interested in is how they can also have an economic or livelihood benefit at the same time. So, we you'll certainly be happy to be sharing our website, where we've kind of consolidated a lot of the stories around this, and we're still gathering stories and examples of really inspiring cases where local communities are making a difference around the world.
All right, I'm not quite sure how you're going to answer this, but if the focus here is on people in poverty, and how immune are wealthy people to climate change, and how does that factor into actually kind of thinking about people in poverty?
Well, I mean, that's a really it's a really good point, and we're living in a COVID-19 era now. We know that statistics are showing that anybody can catch COVID-19. In a sense, you're not, you don't escape it if you're wealthier. But we also know the statistics are showing that poorer people, disadvantaged people, indigenous people, many groups are more susceptible, more at risk for various reasons to COVID-19. Well, to me, it's the same thing with climate change, that the more disadvantaged and marginalized are more susceptible to climate risks. But at the same time, I think, we can see very clearly that all of us can be affected by climate change. So we can all benefit from mitigation and adaptation activities, no matter the wealth level, no matter where we are. So basically, we all are in it together. But part of being in it together, I think, is for the wealthier, let me say the wealthier nations, to be realizing that bringing the poorer nations along, moving them along on the climate mitigation and adaptation front, but also moving those poorer nations along on the poverty reduction and food security front, doing that together has an advantage for everyone.
Well, I'm not sure if you follow it all, and this is again this sort of a first world issue, but like in South Florida, there's some climate gentrification going on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but like people in poor neighborhoods are a little bit higher sea level areas. And so some real estate speculators are coming and buying property there because those places right on the coast, the higher income properties, are going to be the first ones to go under. And so now they're kind of shifting. And so I could see that, I guess, in poorer countries, that playing out access to food and all those sorts of things. So it's just going to play out in a million different ways. I got a comment and a question from Sarah in the chat room here. So she says, in the report, one of the recommendations is to build institutional capacity for these cross-cutting initiatives by, quote, drawing on insights from integrated management initiatives focusing on certain spatial areas such as watershed management, coastal and ocean management, which typically have built on existing institutional synergies. And her question is, can you elaborate on why focusing on a spatial area may help build institutional capacity?
Hmm. Well, that quote from the report reminds me that it may not be, all that enjoyable as bedtime reading, but in any case, yes, the idea of the spatial areas, or in other words, a particular part of the land that you can draw a boundary around. So a watershed, for example, is defined by where the rivers flow into a certain area. But you can also look at any other spatial area. And the reason that that can be important in different ways is that those tend to be defining ecosystems. And so from a point of view of both the conservation side and the climate impact side, particular ecosystems tend to have their own features that need to be looked at. So you need to understand a little bit about the natural world in order to be effective in climate responses, but also to be effective, I would argue, in human responses to poverty reduction and food security. I mean, food in particular, particular spatial areas tend to have particular kinds of food. And so if you're dealing with local food, that's going to be an important ingredient. But that's not to say that everything has to be looked at with these spatial areas, the spatially defined areas, but it just can help in some cases.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of the episode here, and I think I want to end on a positive note, and I'm wondering if you can make a positive response here. And my background is in wildlife conservation, and I was doing adaptation for a long time, and there was sort of this naive hope that society doesn't prioritize wildlife conservation like we think they should. But adaptation came along and says it's a new way of looking at these old issues, and maybe there's an opportunity to do it better. Is that potentially the case? Because poverty, we have been focusing on poverty for a long time. Even though things are going to probably get a lot worse, do you see it? You're there sort of in the trenches. Are there opportunities with the funding that's out there that maybe addressing poverty in a more profound way because under this climate change framework?
Well, yes. I think those who are concerned about poverty and about food security and about development generally, concerned for developing countries, for example, would say that actually they might split into two different camps, or at least they would have two different perspectives. One is that all the worry about climate change is taking money away from development and poverty reduction and so on. That would be a negative way to look at it, obviously. But on the positive side, and you asked for positive, and I think there is positive here. On the positive side, what is actually, I think, happening is that as we look at climate and what a serious issue to have to deal with, climate change, of course, I think we're realizing that if we want to make the best progress on dealing with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, then we really can't isolate ourselves in a bubble. We really have to be looking at those who are disadvantaged, those who are marginalized in poverty with food insecurity, and help them along in the path, And I don't mean you and I, personally helping along, but I think we need the international organizations, the national efforts that help that along with the right policies, the right practices. And so, that is, in fact, I think it is an opportunity to get development right and to deal with climate at the same time.
All right. Well, that's this positive that's been that you can sign of the times. Well, before we wrap up here, what's next for you? You have your report, and you're not traveling much, but what's going to keep you busy for the next 6 months?
Well, we are trying to put that report into a form of academic journal articles that could be seen by a different kind of audience. We're also looking at case study, like actually implementing the framework that we've been developing in particular locations. One being the Caribbean, as I mentioned. But also, I'm looking a lot with the Community Conservation Research Network. We have a book coming out at the end of this year hopefully through IUCN. We have a new film that's just come out in the last couple of months that we're very excited about. So there's a number of items that we're basically trying to build up the idea of how local communities can make a difference. And that's a bit of a passion for mine, because I've seen communities in so many parts of the world that are doing truly wonderful things. And part of that is climate adaptation, succeeding in adapting in some very tough conditions. And there's another success story.
All right. Well, we'd love to have you back on, maybe focus on another, one of these things that you're working on. Simpatico is we're telling these stories, you know, it's climate adaptation channel, and appreciate the work that you're doing. And obviously the focus on poverty, incredibly important. I want to bring you into just chatting, but we're going to close out this episode, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Doug. This was very interesting.
All right. Hold on just one sec.